Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Nathan Hill, the New York Times bestselling author of The Knicks, is back with a poignant and witty novel about marriage, the often baffling pursuit of health and happiness, and the stories that bind us together. From the gritty 90s Chicago art scene to a suburbia of detox diets and home renovation hysteria, Wellness reimagines the love story with a dose of insight, irony, and heart. Nathan Hill's The Knicks was named the #1 book of 2016 by Entertainment Weekly and one of the year's best books by the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, and many others. The new novel is Wellness, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Nathan Hill to this week's book show. Nathan, thank you so much for being with us. What a pleasure to have you on the program.
Of course. Thank you for the invite. I appreciate it.
So what brought you to this particular story and the 90s?
This has a strange origin story, this book. I wrote a short story when I was maybe in my mid-20s. I just moved to New York City at the time after school, and I was living in this tiny studio apartment in Queens, and my lone window in that apartment looked out into this wall of other windows in other apartments. I had this idea for this short story where two people were kind of glimpsing each other across this alley, similar to the one I had, and slowly kind of becoming interested in each other, and then falling in love. And I just wrote that as maybe a three-page short story, and forgot about it for a long time until maybe 15 years later. I was in my 40s, happily married for a long time, and certain things were happening that made me think about that story. It was the era where you remember that era when like people were just starting to become kind of weird on Facebook, like the conspiracies were just starting to erupt, people were like sharing things. I'm like, really? Do you actually believe that? And like my friends and I were all suddenly we felt like this imperative to like take care of our bodies in ways that we had never felt like before. Like suddenly we were like tracking our macros and our steps and our counting our calories. And anyway, it just felt like there were all these things happening that were new, and I had this feeling that like I don't know that the world was getting kind of cracked up into kind of silos of different stories that people were believing in, and it's no secret that it's been kind of difficult for all of us to agree on an objective reality these last several years. And I thought back to that story that I wrote in my 20s about this couple who were fantasizing about each other across the way. And I was just like, this might be an interesting container for a book about belief and a book about the stories that we believe in and how those stories shape our world. Because a love story is full of fantasy. And in this case, this love story was full of kind of delusion. These people were falling in love with each other, but they had never actually met. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to write a love story. I'm going to write a marriage story, but it's going to be a bit of a Trojan horse for a larger story about belief and about storytelling and about how we shape our worlds by the stories that we believe in.
I have to say, and I say this as a compliment, not as any criticism, but I was surprised that we meet Jack and Elizabeth early on, and I thought a book that of this size that the courting period would take up a pretty good chunk, and it doesn't. You get us to that point of marriage rather quickly.
Yeah, I think there's this opening fanfare that's about maybe 30, 35 pages or
Right.
so. That's their meet cute. And it is, I wanted to write just something really romantic. And I wanted them to have this story that they could, hang on to the rest of their lives. I really wanted them to be like Romeo and Juliet if they didn't die at the end of the play. And and, uh, and then yeah, the book fast forwards pretty quickly. It fast forwards 20 years, and we see that life has happened, and they've been married for a long time. They have a child, and that has its own challenges. They feel pretty overwhelmed. Life hasn't quite turned out how they thought it would be, and that sort of gave me the opportunity to sort of peel back the onion layers on this couple and kind of keep going back and forth as an excavation, as to see, to try to figure out how it is they got here, and then also watch them as they pursue various strategies to kind of get out of their dilemma.
You talk about the Romeo and Juliet story minus death, but the two words that really summarize that are "come with."
Yeah, it's the first two words that Jack says to Elizabeth when they finally speak and meet for the first time. He just kind of comes up to her. She's in the middle of this very bad date, and he extends his hand and says, "Come with." I wanted his first words to be completely without guile, like just completely almost pure and innocent. And I remember, I grew up in various suburbs of various Midwestern cities, and I remember kids would show up on their bikes and fly by my house and yell like "come with," and like it just has that kind of quality, that kind of childlike quality to it. And Elizabeth is someone who, because of how she was raised, she has a lot of emotional armor, and so I just wanted this guy to just be completely pure, innocent, almost naive, and I figured that would be someone that could appeal to her, someone without ulterior motive.
So tell us a little bit about the baseline knowledge that you feel we should have about Jack and Elizabeth. Jack is an artist, a photographer, and Elizabeth, ultimately, wellness comes from the company that she works for, and is a scientist and doing incredible work.
Yeah, yeah, they're very different people. Jack is an artsy guy. He grew up on the plains of Kansas in the Flint Hills of Kansas. I spent some time in that part of the country. I went to high school in Wichita, Kansas, and then I went to college at the University of Iowa. And so driving back and forth between Wichita and Iowa City, I would drive through the Flint Hills. And if you've never seen it, it's a really gorgeous and unique landscape. It's the last big tract of tall grass prairie that's left in the entire country, and it's just rolling hills for miles and nothing but grass, very few trees. It's just very, very open. And that's where he grew up. Always sort of longed to get to the big city, which is sort of how I felt like I grew up in the rural and suburban Midwest and always wanted to like, get to the big city and like get into the artsy crowd in Chicago or New York or what have you. And then Elizabeth comes from the Northeast. She's from Connecticut, and she comes from sort of aristocratic family, a family of generational wealth. And she's grown up sort of moving all over as her father kind of acquires this company and that company and kind of moves the family around. And she is looking to get away for other reasons. She's sort of fed up with the mercantilism of her family and wants to build a different kind of life for herself in the Midwest. And so they both come to Chicago for different reasons, but they are both there to become orphans. They're both there to kind of get away from the dysfunction of their families and start something new. And so they recognize that impulse in each other.
We are talking to Nathan Hill. The new novel is Wellness. It is published by Knopf. In what you were looking to explore, yes, there is marriage, but there's so much about our culture. And I mean, you talked about Facebook and how we used it at one time. There's not much that comes out of this novel unscathed in that regard, which is part of the reason why I loved it.
I don't plan my novels to bring so much other stuff into them. I really do begin with just a character story. But then when you kind of get to the heart of this story, that this couple is struggling against I think the thing that a lot of married couples struggle against, which is that, you make this promise on your wedding day that your love will never change, and yet you change, and your spouse changes, and the world changes, and your circumstances change, and sometimes that change is very hard to deal with, and so this couple is dealing with a lot of change, not only in their personal lives, but also in the neighborhood around them, and indeed in the country, and so once I realized that this book was about change, was about how we need to the stories that we use to understand the world need to be necessarily flexible to deal with that change, then suddenly all these other topics flood in. And I'm like, well, now I can talk about placebo. I can talk about conspiracy theory. I can talk
Mm.
about art and representation. And suddenly you start making these connections to other things. The way I kind of think about it is that the first idea that you have for a novel is kind of like that toy slime that I used to play with when I was a
Oh,
kid.
that's
And
the
yeah,
best.
right? And it's like gooey and liquid and like it's kind of disgusting, but you're drawn to it. You're uncontrollably drawn to it. And like it's really malformed. And that's the first idea for a novel. And as you play with it, just like slime, it kind of like picks up the stuff of the world, like dirt and crumbs and whatever. And like that's what the novel kind of does. It like you start playing with this like malformed idea, then it starts picking up stuff like some observation you have, or you read a book about something, you listen to a podcast about something, and it picks up the the stuff, and pretty soon it's got enough stuff that you can start kind of shaping it into something real. And that's what my novels feel like. It's like I begin with this like gooey kind of character idea, but then the more and more I sit with it, the more it picks up the stuff of the world, and it has this kind of magnetic pull. And then suddenly, yeah, I seem to have a lot of subjects in my books, but I feel like they're all sort of sticking to this central idea.
That is one of the best explanations I think I've ever heard about the creative process of you with just disgusting material laden slime, sort of shoving it into that plastic green garbage can, letting it fart
That's right.
away until it's in
You
in there
you know
completely.
exactly what I'm talking about. That's right.
Absolutely. You mentioned placebo, and that's a big part of the book. I mean, that's a major theme, and it's something that Elizabeth deals with in her real life, in her life as a scientist, but it's also something that Jack wrangles with, and it's something that really all these characters wrangle with in a way.
Placebo is so interesting to me, and not only biologically, but also just historically. Like placebo comes from, it's a Latin word that means to be pleasing or to please. We use that word because of a psalm in the King James Bible that begins placebo domino in regione vivorum, which means I will please the Lord in the land of the living. And this was the first song sung by people in the 14th century who were paid to mourn at funerals. They would sing these songs because they were getting paid. And so they were called placebos because that's the first line of the song. And so the word is tied up in these ideas of being pleasing, but also being sort of fake because it was fake mourning, you know? And I really love that idea because I think that's the root problem of both Jack and Elizabeth. They are twisting themselves up in order to be pleasing to the people in their lives, you know, in order to be pleasing to their families or to be pleasing to, you know, the other parents on the play date that, you know, or in the school PTA, to be pleasing to our culture's expectations of them. And in so doing, they've become a little fake, and even to be pleasing to each other, you know. And so I thought, wow, like this is a pretty neat way to kind of talk about the character's inner struggle, but also just placebo itself is super interesting. It's a in a medical context, it is, you know, the body experiencing physical change because of symbolic cues. It is literally the body responding to finding meaning, and that's what this book is about. It's about how our worlds are constructed by the stories we believe about them, and placebo is one of those strong stories. You know, it got attached to the slime at some point, and I was like, this seems obvious. I really need to investigate this.
And it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that it was the gift that kept on giving because it starts out and then you just keep coming back to it and it makes its point again and again, which at all the right times, that's just beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, I remember having this conversation with a buddy of mine, and he was spending a lot of money on these kind of wellness products that I found a little dubious, you know. And I would tell him, I kind of look it up on Google Scholar, and then I would you know let him know like none of this stuff is real. He shot back at me one time. He's like, "What does it matter if it's real if it makes me feel better?" That question sort of haunted me. Like, what does it matter? And, you know, it's no secret that a lot of wellness products don't achieve any results better than placebo. But what suddenly struck me was that placebo sometimes works really well. And sometimes the story that we believe about a product is affecting us more than the product itself. Like the story is more important than the pill. And so yeah, so once I started kind of going down that road, that opened up all sorts of possibilities to me. And yeah, so Elizabeth is doing this work with the placebo effect, but she's not telling her clients that it's placebo because if they know, then it won't work. And there's all sorts of ethical implications on that. I'm super interested to hear what readers think, whether what she's doing is right or not is kind of an open question.
There's really this major scene in the book where she comes to terms where she feels that she has to tell someone that they have been using a placebo. She does ask the question, the very question you. But if it's working, dot dot dot, what do I need to do?
Right, exactly. And I think a lot of us have, you know, do that. Like we tell ourselves stories about ourselves or about our partners, our families, our world. that work for us. But sometimes if we believe those things too rigidly or ideologically, sometimes I think they can calcify into a kind of error. And if we're not flexible in the stories that we believe, then they can become wrong eventually as things change. And so yeah, I mean I've noticed this in myself, of course, and in observations of friends, and I felt like, yeah, Elizabeth would have to modulate at some point. She would have to, start questioning what it is she's doing.
She seems to be a character that is also more willing to do something out of the ordinary, to do something that is quote unquote radical than Jack would be. And this would be going on a to sort of an open marriage and exploring that and different things that Elizabeth is interested in with other characters. I mean, obviously there's something there that is flicking in her that says, "Okay, I want to do this," and Jack seems a little more obviously reticent.
Yeah, I think that's a good reading, and I think that's exactly right. Elizabeth comes from a very privileged background. Her family had a lot of money, and so there would always be. I guess when I was composing it, I figured that Elizabeth would always have a sort of soft landing. No matter, she could be the bold one because there was, in some ways, a little consequence for failure because the money would be there, And so I feel like when you grow up in those circumstances, you're allowed to be a little more bold. Jack grew up in a very precarious situation. His family did not have a lot, and he's a guy who is trying to really cling to feels like he needs to cling to any happiness that he has because he's worried that it's going to go away at any second. And so I figured he would be much more conservative. Like if you don't have much, you don't risk what you have. And so they've brought those stories with them to their marriage. And so I feel like, we have these versions of ourselves, from when we were kids, like that still sort of bubble up within us. Like when I'm having a fight with my wife, I'm responding to some local concern, but I'm also in some ways like that 4-year-old who got injured in some memorable way that left me on guard for that thing forever. And I feel like we have these like different versions of ourselves inside us that kind of come to the fore. And I think with Jack and Elizabeth, what they're doing is sort of nurturing those versions and like nourishing those versions and keeping those versions of themselves strong. And while those other versions of themselves from their younger days were necessary at that time, it's possible that they're not necessary anymore and they need to stop nourishing that. But I just don't think they're aware of it yet. And so the book is kind of a process of them becoming aware of it.
And the awareness also comes through their child, through Toby, seeing what impact their actions are having on their child.
Toby was really, really fun to write. He doesn't respond in the way that they want him to respond. Especially Elizabeth is trying to, I mean, she's such a scientist and she's such a thoughtful mother that she is trying to inform her parenthood with the best scientific practices from like child psychology. But, Toby doesn't respond in the way he should according to best practices because, you can't use these generalized findings to parent an individual child. But so yeah, so Toby was great fun. He was kind of a great foil to both Jack and Elizabeth. And yeah, and he's kind of driving Elizabeth crazy because none of the best strategies are working on him.
Nathan Hill's new novel is Wellness. The book is published by Knopf. I'm curious as to how you write the book. It's far from linear. We're going back and forth. We're going in, we're going out, we're going into various time frames. So, how do you keep track of that? And is it a sense where you're creating it at some point where the sections are written and then it is built? Or how exactly does the slime get distributed?
That's a great question. I wanted to write this love story that was a little bit different. I wanted to capture the dynamic that one has with a real partner or spouse in life, which is that you get to know them forwards and backwards simultaneously. So you get to know them forwards by going on dates with them or moving in with them or what have you, getting to know them. And you get to know them backwards by piecing together their past. You meet their old friends, you meet their parents, you see where they grew up, and you achieve this synthesis of like who this person is based on living with them forwards and backwards at the same time. And so I wanted to replicate that feeling for the reader with my two characters. So I wanted the narrative to be flexible enough that it could bounce back. And so we'd see them when they were children, and then we'd see them in college, and then we'd see them in the present, and then and I didn't want this to feel like flashback. I wanted every scene to feel like it was pushing the story forward with some kind of narrative momentum. And yeah, as you can imagine, that was a big headache producer. Like I have this wall in my office that's just covered with cork board, and I have all these color-coded note cards for character and time and place. I would have all these scenes that I knew that I wanted to have in the book, and I would be arranging them and then rearranging them and rearranging them. And then I thought I had a good outline, but then every time, then this happens to me all the time when I'm writing in the chair and like I have this idea that's way more surprising and interesting and wonderful than anything I had on the cork board. If something surprises me in the chair, I'll always go for it because if it surprises me, I figure it'll surprise a reader too. And so down come all the note cards and I rearrange and accommodate the new idea and then I start going again and then always another idea pops up. And so I feel like there's this constant conversation happening between like the outline on the cork board and what's
Mm.
actually happening in the chair every morning and until eventually it kind of all clicked into place after a long drafting process.
And in that long drafting process, is there a lot of moving around? Like this is better here than there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think almost every scene was somewhere else at one point. The only thing I knew that I wanted for sure was that kind of opening fanfare that you talked about earlier, the first 30, 35 pages. I wanted a fabulously romantic beginning because I wanted that to be sort of the paradise lost that they're going to be yearning for when they're older. And so I knew I wanted that first. After that, it was chaos.
We talked about placebo and that being one theme that you come back to. The other is the painting Prairie on Fire. That's a metaphor that you use several times in the novel as well.
Sometimes the world just gives you gifts. I wanted to write about the Flint Hills mostly because I was writing the bulk of this novel during a long pandemic lockdown where I felt very claustrophobic. And in my own life, the landscape that I most associate with openness is the Flint Hills in Kansas. I couldn't see vistas during lockdown, but I could visit them in my book. So that's the primary reason the Flint Hills showed up. But then I start researching the Flint Hills and really looking at it. And Jack is an artist, so I just decided, well, what kind of art history comes from that part of the country? And you discover that that painters who came with westward expansion could not figure out how to portray the plains in a way that was beautiful to the collectors back home. They were all schooled in kind of the Hudson River school of landscape painting, where you've got trees and mountains and vanishing points and rivers, and so how do you make a landscape as flat as the Flint Hills come alive on a two-dimensional canvas? They just couldn't do it. And when they did, the collectors back home were not used to that kind of landscape. And so everybody just said it was empty, that there was nothing there. And in fact, they called it the Great American Desert for a very long time. And partly it was just because you couldn't represent it. And it didn't fall within the bounds of what the art community considered beautiful at the time. And therefore, it was not beautiful. And I just found that so interesting that if you stand in the Flint Hills and look around, you can't help but feel wonder. And yet, because it did not accord to kind of the mainstream taste at the time, nobody could see it. And it just struck me as an example of like sometimes when you cling too hard to a story, you miss what's actually going on.
I want to ask this question, and I certainly realize it's a personal question, and it's also none of my damn business, but I am curious. And that is in reading this book, and I'm a 55-year-old guy who's been married for 30 years. So that's where I come in. And I think of you writing this book, and I wonder, in being as introspective as you are and as investigative as you are, how your own marriage survives that.
That's a great question. Um, and it's true. I would read some of these passages to my wife, and by the way, I've been married for almost 10 years now, very happily, and and my wife and I were dated for 10 years before that, so we've been together for 20 years. And I would read some of these passages, and she would just kind of smile and shake her head and just be like, "Everybody's going to think this is about me. Everybody's going to think this is about us." And yet she was incredibly supportive nonetheless because she's wonderful. But it's true that sometimes I would be sitting in a scene where my two main characters were in this marriage that was in trouble. And then I would, and there's a real kind of transport that happens emotionally when you're kind of sitting in that for a long time. And I would come out of my office after 6 hours in that emotional place and see my wife, and I would have to remember that we were not fighting, that everything was okay between us. I felt like kind of cloudy inside still. So it was that was. You're absolutely right. That was a little bit of a challenge, but it was also kind of wonderful because I was really investigating kind of these themes of like what love really is and how love can modulate over the decades, and it just opened up a space for my wife and I to talk about that. And I think those conversations are really important for every couple to have. So it ended up being really wonderful. But my wife, of course, is worried that everybody thinks that she's Elizabeth.
Well, it seems the other way of looking at it, which is ultimately the way I was looking at it, was that also it's the outsider's perspective. It would be your perspective of looking at other people's marriages and how they contrast and wondering what's going on there that gives you the interest to be able to dig that deep.
Yeah, it's funny. I feel like everybody's marriage is like a black box of weird mysteries and secrets, and from the outside, you just cannot know what's happening on the inside. I know that the friends of mine, the good close friends of mine that have gotten divorced, after the divorce happens, like all this information tumbles out that we had no idea was happening
Right.
when we were very close friends with them. And it's also interesting that the friends of mine who've gotten divorced did not get divorced because they didn't get along. They almost got divorced because they got along so well that they couldn't bear to reveal darker secrets to their partner, that they held their partner in such esteem that almost they couldn't be real with them anymore. And that's the kind of dynamic I wanted to investigate. A marriage that's in trouble, not because they don't get along, but because they've stopped being truthful with each other, because they love each other that much that it feels almost dangerous to be vulnerable to this person who means so much to you, and the consequences of that kind of behavior. That's the kind of marriage I wanted to look at.
Nathan Hill's new novel is Wellness. It is published by Knopf. Thanks to our producer, Sarah LeDuc. Write to us at book@wamc.org. The latest on National Productions programs is available via the Airwaves newsletter at wamc.org and on social media at WAMC Radio. Bookmark us for next week, and thanks for listening for The Book Show. I'm Joe Donahue.